If you left Scandinavia in the 9th century as part of a Viking raiding party, the potential rewards were huge, but so were the risks. Every man, and perhaps even some women, would need to know how to fight. Not just against the enemy in the shield wall, but potentially against your fellow Vikings, to defend your honour and settle scores.
The exploits of Viking warriors like Ragnar Lothbrok and Ivar the Boneless are as famous today as they were in the early Middle Ages. But as with almost everything related to the Viking era, it's hard to know where history ends and legend begins. Contemporary accounts are written not by the Vikings themselves, but by the predominantly Christian people they encountered, who often paint the Norsemen as instruments of divine judgment. The archaeology is patchy too for the period once commonly known as the Dark Ages. But we do know that large numbers of warlike people from the area of modern Scandinavia left their homes in the 9th and 10th centuries in search of riches and perhaps a new life. They used highly advanced longships to navigate the river systems of Eastern Europe and crossed an ocean to reach as far west as the North American coastline. We also know that in the 860s, a confederation of Viking groups joined together in one massive force to conquer the kingdoms of Anglo-Saxon England. In this episode, I've joined up with Blodorn Engla and Halder Reenactment, groups that practice full contact Viking combat, to see what it might have been like to take to the battlefield with this Great Heathen Army. Using a range of historical sources and a little hands-on experience, we'll try to piece together what a Viking invasion looked like from the perspective of the invaders. I'll discover how the warriors of the Great Army lived while on campaign, what it was really like to fight in a shield wall.
All five guys!
And in a Viking duel. And just how likely it was that you'd make it out alive. The army that landed on the English coast in 865 was different to anything that had come before, carried across the North Sea in perhaps several hundred longships. Raiding parties had launched coastal attacks and even spent the winter on English soil, but had never aimed at conquest or settlement. Called the Mikael here, or Great Army in Old English, this new force posed an existential threat to the four major English kingdoms of East Anglia, Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex.
A great heathen army came into English land, and they took up winter quarters in East Anglia. There they were given horses, and the inhabitants made peace with them.
While this brief entry suggests a rather cordial start to the invasion, it wasn't long before the Vikings made their intentions clear. In 866, the army moved up quickly to York, attacking the city on Palm Sunday, a move surely calculated to catch the Christian defenders off guard. The Northumbrians and their leaders were slaughtered. Next, the Viking host moved south into a third English kingdom, Mercia. While the details on these specific camps are often frustratingly vague, we know that the invaders used natural features and even existing Saxon buildings as the basis for their defences. Almost all of the Viking camps were built next to rivers, understandable given the reliance on their longships, with a D-shaped enclosure on the landward side proving the most popular layout. And for safety, each main base would likely have been surrounded by smaller subsidiary outposts, providing reconnaissance and a first line of defence against enemy forces.
The Viking presence in Britain can still be felt through the names of places they settled, the common English words and surnames of Norse origin, and the genetic makeup of the population. And that's why for this episode, I've partnered with MyHeritage to find out how far I can trace my own family history. Because who wouldn't want to know if they're a descendant of the Vikings?
So I'm going to get started by adding my immediate family members to my tree. Here's me at the bottom, and once you've added details for your parents and grandparents, you're going to start making discoveries very quickly. The MyHeritage site puts over 19 billion historical records at your fingertips, and in my first session I came across this in the military archives. I never knew that my great-great-grandfather Elijah Descent served in Egypt with the 20th Hussars during the 1880s, earning a medal for taking part in the Battle of Toski in 1889. Through Elijah's grandmother, Maria Boggis, I've been able to trace my family to the village of Brettenham in Suffolk in the early 1700s, 10 generations back in time. It's all been fun and very easy to do the research. There's a feature called Instant Discoveries which notifies you when the site has found a confident match, and with the click of a button, you can add a whole new branch to your family tree. But my favourite tool is this one that allows you to colorise, repair and enhance your old black and white family photos. I'm going to keep going and see just how far back I can delve into the 1600s and beyond. The next step will be to send MyHeritage a DNA sample to see if I can find that Scandinavian connection, so keep an eye out for that in a future episode. But for now, go and sign up for a 14-day free trial with MyHeritage using the link in the description below. Meanwhile, back in the 9th century, I was still getting my bearings. This camp might be modest in size, but at places like Torksey in Lincolnshire, the Vikings spread themselves over an area of 136 acres, 75 modern football pitches, a huge enclosure that would have accommodated thousands of people and their livestock. We know from descriptions in European sources, and even tent poles found in Viking burials, that these places would have resembled canvas cities, complete with pop-up blacksmiths, silversmiths and bakeries. There'd have been women and children here too, some out of choice and some not. Slavery was an accepted feature of Viking and Saxon society.
Now, your accommodation would probably be a canvas tent like this one, perhaps not quite as luxurious as this setup with the raised bed. Unless you brought your family over with you, you'd be sharing with perhaps half a dozen other warriors, men from your local area back in Scandinavia. And the camps themselves were arranged by ship's company. So you'd be in a close-knit community with men who had shared that hazardous journey with you over the North Sea. You'd be closely bonded, but you'd still get on each other's nerves. In the largest of the Viking winter camps, like the one at Torksey, you could have had up to 5,000 individuals living on top of each other. And it's easy to forget that for these Scandinavian farmers and fishermen, it would probably have been the first taste of urban living. It was quite a dramatic lifestyle change.
The pattern of warfare in early medieval Europe was seasonal, meaning that for almost half the year, Viking armies spent most of their time inside the camps. As well as the problem of staying warm, there was the logistical challenge of trying to keep large numbers of people fed and watered. We know from archaeological evidence that they hunted, foraged, and went fishing for themselves. Ploughshares have even been found at one camp. But they'd also need to rely on control of the local countryside and tribute from subjugated enemies. There was also the problem of localised epidemics, with sanitation likely to have been basic at best. One French source celebrated an outbreak of disease, possibly dysentery, in a Viking camp after they had desecrated an important monastery near Paris.
Those who had sacked Saint-Denis became ill with various ailments. Some went mad, some were covered with sores, and some discharged their guts with a watery flow through their arses, and so they died.
And of course, there was the problem of keeping an army of impatient warriors occupied.
Now, during the restless winter months, you'd spend your leisure time trying to win hard-earned loot off your friend with board games like Nefertafel, a game of strategy, wit, and patience. Oh, come on.
These board game pieces, usually crudely fashioned in lead, were so common that they're one of the key indicators of the Great Army's presence, along with weapons, weights for use in trade, and coins outside their usual area of circulation. Surprisingly, dirhams minted in the Islamic kingdoms of the Middle East regularly turn up at Viking sites in Britain, demonstrating the extensive reach of the Viking trade networks. But beyond a love of board games and portable wealth, there wasn't a huge amount holding this force together. The Great Viking Army was made up of groups not just from Scandinavia, but those who had raided and settled northern France, the Low Countries, the northern British Isles and Ireland, speaking a whole range of dialects. This massive but motley assembly of raiding parties had joined to make plundering England easier, but they probably didn't expect to stay together for long, and they certainly didn't trust each other. In this febrile environment, where loyalties to your own warband or brotherhood were far stronger than those towards the army as a whole, you'd need to keep your wits about you.
Please do remember, guys, to subscribe to the channel, leave us a comment, and like this video. Ah! Whoa, sorry.
This wasn't good. Even a trivial slight could be taken as an affront to your reputation in the Viking world, where honour and status meant everything. I'd need to seek out my own captain for advice before I got into any more trouble.
Oh, Tom, I'm glad I found you, mate.
I've heard you're a dead man walking.
Or what do you mean?
You've angered one of our shield maidens and she's challenged you to a Holmgang.
Okay, what's a Holmgang?
You'll need a weapon, come with me.
It turned out I'd just offended the leader of another warband. Joanna was a warrior with a fearsome reputation. Even more worryingly, a Holmgang was a legally sanctioned duel, sometimes fought to the death. A simple apology wasn't going to cut it.
Wow, okay. This feels a bit more real now, Tom. We've got quite a fearsome array of weapons. We've got some helmets here. I'm guessing I'm going to need some head protection first of all, right?
Head protection will be important to protect your head. So we have a varying selection of helmets from our time period. We have 3 spectacle helmets here. This is the Yermanbu helmet, which is found in Norway. This is a copy of the Tjela helmet, found in Denmark, or a spectacle of it. And this is an earlier helmet with full face protection.
These are fearsome looking things with the chainmail hanging down. I mean, part of this look must be to intimidate the enemy as much as protecting your face, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. Take away the face and you could be anyone behind of it. In a more European context, so these are quite a Scandinavian look, we don't have much evidence to suggest that the Saxons, the English, were wearing this type of helmet. You have a Spangen helm or a nasal helm, which means the banded helm with just the nasal, which obviously extends right the way down to your teeth to stop anything cutting across you.
So this one looks almost like a later Norman helmet, doesn't it? I guess these lasted for quite a long time, were in fashion for a while.
Exactly. So they stay right the way through our time period, pretty much. You'll have nasal helms depicted. We don't have a lot found, but a lot of depictions of these banded helms, and in the manuscripts they'll show the little riveted dots where it has been riveted together.
So as a total novice and unexperienced fighter like myself, Which one do you think I should be going for? Should I be prioritizing full face protection? Should I be trying to maintain some of that vision with something like this? What would you recommend, Tom, to keep me alive in this Holmgang?
Very much each to their own. I would say, as a true Viking warrior, the most Viking of helmets would be appropriate. This is the one helmet that we have found that we know is 100% a Viking helmet, found in a burial, a cremation burial. And in order to imbue the spirit of the Viking warrior, this is the helmet for you.
Let's give this a try. So this is a spectacle helmet, but we have got at least some space left for vision.
And neck protection.
Got some neck protection, so I'm guessing that's what this hood is for, right? To stop the chainmail kind of touching your skin.
Of course, I mean, the mail is going to be quite abrasive. You don't want a cheese grater on the back of your neck. So any form of cloth protection can protect you from the metal and pad out any of those shots coming into the neck.
How terrifying I look at the moment.
Fearsome, fearsome. We're quaking in our boots already.
Excellent, so the intimidation value has gone up from 0 to 1, that's good to know.
Clearly, scaring my opponent to death wasn't going to be an option. I would need to rely on something more conventional.
Okay, so I'm going to go with this helmet. Weapon choice, we've got quite a variety of fighting styles here, haven't we? I imagine each of these has very much their strengths and weaknesses. Maybe we start with a spear. I'm guessing that's the most common weapon you might see on the battlefield.
The most common weapon. It uses a very small amount of iron and yet is on a very long handle. These can be used either two-handed or single-handed with a shield. You'll be looking for stabs with this. So on a shorter head, you're not going to pick up enough momentum to do slashing. We do have hewing spears found, but this is to go through the face, neck, eye sockets, and it will be down to your accuracy if you feel that you can line it up and take that shot.
Okay, it's kind of interesting. These are quite short, right? I'm guessing this is because the Vikings generally, they're not fighting against anyone on horseback, right? They're not trying to sort of take the point of the spear as far away from them as possible. These are for an anti-infantry weapon.
So the main reason for the length here is because if you're holding a shield in the other hand, you need to be able to balance it. You need to be able to hold it in the middle and be able to control it. Obviously, single-handed, it's much more difficult to control.
Yes.
So you don't want to be holding something that's 9 foot long in one hand.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And these are primarily for thrusting. Would they ever be throwing spears at all? Do we have any evidence of Vikings throwing spears?
We know that javelins were definitely used in the Battle of Maldon. It mentions that that javelins were exchanged before the shield wall was engaged. Obviously, you don't want to lose all your weapons, so maybe you would have some specific javelins for throwing, and then your main spear, which is what you would proceed through the battle with.
Okay, so spear sounds like quite a good option, but I mean, for me, perhaps it looks like it needs quite a bit of skill. At least you're keeping the distance of your enemy, but if they kind of come inside the sort of length of the spear, you're
Once
in a bit
that
of trouble.
distance is closed, can you reach for your knife quick enough? Are you able to take on that attack of the short arm, getting past the point, the dangerous part of the spear? Your next weapon would be the single-handed axe. We know that the Vikings used these a lot. We find them in Scandinavian graves, always buried with their owners. The main thing here is that this can attack through a shield. You can punch a hole through a shield and again hack. Once the shield is taken out of play, your enemy is then open. So you feel the heft there. People think of Vikings as having massive bearded axes. They do later have the two-handed Dane axe.
Yeah.
However, if you were to swing something single-handed, it's only ever going to be the size of a hammer. It's a tool. You need to be able to fight with it.
So you can feel that all the weight of this is in the top, right? So you are bringing this down on someone, and all that momentum is travelling through the end of the weapon.
Absolutely.
And you'd imagine that the Vikings who have been who've come over, a lot of them farmers, a lot of them boat builders, fishermen. They've probably been handling axes all their lives, right? So they're going to know how to use it in anger as well.
Exactly, it is a tool as well as a weapon. There are differences in wood cutting axes and fighting axes. Normally the blade profile is a lot thinner on a fighting axe because it's to sink into flesh rather than wood.
Okay, finally, I might be able to afford this if I've just raided a monastery, but perhaps most people wouldn't. The sword, right?
The sword, absolutely. So this is the weapon of the nobility. This is for one use only. A spear can be used for hunting, an axe can be used for splitting wood, a sword is purely for killing.
Yeah.
This is a weapon and a weapon only. It's very expensive to build a sword, forging the blade out, and you use a huge amount of iron. Their steel making capabilities were very minimal, so they would pattern welding them with soft iron and hard iron and layering it up. And we can see these in the finds. You can see the pattern going through it where the different irons have been built up to create a laminate.
It's a beautiful thing, isn't it? I'm guessing the skill to use this is a bit more of a steep learning curve, right, than with an axe. You've got lots of different types of motion that you can do with this: thrusting, hacking, the bottom as well if you want to be a thug.
The amount of theory that can go into sword fighting, people can talk about for days. And as we go into later periods, they will have treatises, manuscripts on exactly how to use one of these weapons, the geometry of the fight, the angle and alignment of the blade. You can spend years studying a sword. And for a first weapon, that's on you to decide.
With a choice of weapons, a well-made helmet and a large circular shield, I'd already be better equipped than most Vikings who arrived in England in the 860s. But I needed all the help I could get for my duel, and there was one last item on my shopping list.
Their mail shirts glinted, hard and hand-linked. The high-gloss iron of their armour rang.
Last thing I might need, and I'm guessing not all Viking warriors would have had it.
Of course not.
But some chainmail, some of this stuff. How does it work?
So, chainmail is a Victorian word for mail, which comes from mesh, which is French. And it's made up of interlocking links that are then riveted together to stop them popping. So with a spear or an arrow, if the links are just butted, if they just meet, a point can force them open. However, if each one is riveted, it makes it incredibly hard to rip and tear open. This is to stop against slashing weapons. Obviously, it moves like fabric and will do absolutely nothing against blunt force trauma, which is why we see maces and heavier weapons come in, because you don't always need to cut, you can just break bones. So, here we have a shirt of mail.
Here's one you made earlier.
Absolutely. Many, many hours of riveting each one together. As you can see, it moves like fabric. It does not feel like fabric.
Yeah, that is it's a big lump, isn't it? It's a big lump. So anyone using this has got a decision to make whether they want that amount of weight on them. I'm guessing if you've trained with it for quite a while, I'm actually getting tired holding this up. If you've been training with this for a long time, you probably get used to it, but...
When the weight's distributed over your body, over your shoulders, you'll always choose to have that protection over not have that protection. They were strong warriors, they trained for battle. This is what they did. It was also a massive status. This was equivalent to owning a ship. You would be a jarl, you would be a thane, or you would be a herseer if you owned something of this level.
So if you've got this, you've got a spectacle helmet and you've got a sword, you are basically saying, I'm the boss here.
Absolutely, you have all the protection that was available at the time period.
Once I'd actually got the thing on, I'd be feeling much more confident about going into battle. The reality was that equipment such as this was outside the budget of an ordinary Viking warrior. But still, hoards like this one found at Watlington in Oxfordshire show us just how much wealth individual warriors could acquire. It was often at the expense of Saxon leaders who were tempted to buy off the invaders. Burgred of Mercia was forced to pay the Great Army an immense sum of silver when they occupied London. And we know Charles the Fat attempted to appease the Vikings during the siege of Paris in 886 with 700 livres of silver, over 250 kilograms. This seems to have been a short-sighted strategy, however, as the Vikings showed little compunction about breaking oaths and treaties made with Christian enemies, often returning with the threat of violence the following year. If I was going to get rich quick and pay for my equipment, I'd need to do some raiding of my own. Monastic sites might have been easy pickings for hit-and-run seaborne attacks, but as the Vikings switched strategy from raiding to conquest, they inevitably faced more organised resistance. The Franks had eventually learned that they could use fortified bridges and blockades to stop the longships penetrating deep into their territory, while King Alfred in Wessex built a series of garrisoned settlements called burhs at strategic points. He also initiated reforms which gave him something close to a standing army, a revolutionary idea at a time when peasant levies were called upon sporadically to meet short-term military needs. After years of being run ragged by the Great Army, it meant the English could finally seize the initiative.
The Vikings in England didn't have it all their own way, far from it. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records numerous occasions when the men of Wessex and Mercia attacked their fortifications, and it was often a very close-run thing.
When the army of Wessex had reached the gate of the stronghold by hacking and cutting down all the Vikings whom they had found outside, the Vikings fought no less keenly. Like wolves, they burst out of all the gates and joined the battle with all their might.
I'd taken my place in our shield wall, or Skjaldborg in Old Norse, and was hoping to avoid an early check-in to Valhalla. Although contemporary sources give limited clues as to how the shield wall actually operated, I was with a group who'd given it plenty of practice.
Right, so Tom, we're in the shield wall. We can see that the enemy are forming what might be called a wedge formation, something like that.
They're forming up into a boar snout to break our shield wall. So they'll be coming up with one man on the point to drive a wedge through the wall. And all we have to do is hold strong and stop it.
So this is normally quite a strong formation, two flat shield walls against each other.
Overlapping.
It's going to be very difficult to break through. So this is a tactic for breaking through, punching a hole in our wall.
Exactly.
Blood on! Prepare to take force now!
The Vikings, splitting up into two divisions, organised shield walls of equal size. When the Christians saw this, they too split up the army into two divisions in exactly the same way, and established shield walls no less keenly. The opposing armies clashed violently, with loud shouting from all, one side acting wrongfully, and the other side set to fight for life, loved ones, and country.
Our battle ended in something like a draw, but it was clear that the shield wall relied on discipline and group cohesion to work. A single weak link could spell disaster for an army. One Viking stereotype that was hard to reconcile with this style of warfare was the raging Berserker, biting on their shields like wolves and charging unthinkingly into enemy lines clad in nothing but animal skins, at least according to the sagas. There are certainly no references to berserkers in the context of the Great Army, but it did sound like they'd be handy in single combat. With that in mind, and with my duel fast approaching, I went off in search of some last-minute advice.
Okay, Phil, so this is my last few moments of relaxation really before I enter the Holmgang. Have you got any last tips for me? I was wondering if perhaps I should try and go berserk. Is there any historic accuracy in that concept?
There's evidence of it, but I don't think you've got time to be able to find the right mushrooms that aren't going to put you in an early grave. At this point, you're fighting somebody with a spear. And typically what you've seen today is a lot of hand-to-hand with swords and hand axes and danes, but more predominantly on the Viking battlefield there would have been many more spears. So your challenge now is the fact you're fighting somebody with a spear. They've got the distance on you. You will have a shield and an axe. Your objective is to try and run that spear down as safely and quickly as possible and eliminate your opponent. Otherwise she will skewer you.
Okay, and we've seen the damage that the spear can do with the watermelon earlier. I hope I don't end up like that fruit that we saw. Phil, the armour that we're wearing today, the warriors that you've got here at the training camp, everyone's extremely well decked out in full chainmail helmets, all that kind of stuff. Do you think that the real Great Viking army would have been this well protected?
Certainly not, and again that's reflective of a lot of the finds that are available. There's limited evidence of chainmail and helmets. Now one can speculate, you know, something of such high value would have been kept and cherished and passed on, and yes, a lot of high status burials have these things within them, but certainly on the Viking battlefield, as I said, it would have been predominantly more lightly armoured, if not no armour at all, you know, just tunics, trousers, hose, winnegers and turn shoes, and the majority of them using spears.
It's quite terrifying to imagine that they'd be going into battles like we've seen happen today with less protection, right? With their heads potentially bare. There's going to be some serious injuries.
There's a lot of evidence as well.
More.
There's skulls that have been found with axes embedded in their faces. Many Viking burials are missing limbs. So it wasn't a particularly nice time.
One such burial, found at Repton in Derbyshire, gives us a grim insight into the kind of injuries you could inflict in the 9th century. Found near a Viking camp built on top of a Mercian royal site, the so-called Repton warrior was found buried with a sword, a Thor's hammer amulet, and a boar's tusk between his legs. Why? He'd received an axe blow to his inner thigh that had likely chopped off his genitals. Ouch! He also had hideous facial injuries, likely caused by a spear thrust to the eye. He was clearly a high-status individual, but sadly, the Vikings left us with no other clues to his identity.
And it's frustrating, isn't it, that the accounts that we have, perhaps of the Great Viking Army itself, they come from their opponents. They don't generally come from the Vikings themselves. The Vikings aren't writing anything until the sagas, which are centuries later.
Yeah. So typically quite illiterate, but a lot of pictography with the designs and the stylistics. So they were certainly an artistic people, but they didn't write things down. It very much was, you know, the skald and the storytelling and the songs. And again, that kind of happens. It changes and evolves over time as one person tells it and details change. And that's where things like the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and the Viking sagas come from. Is it can't 100% be classed as gospel, but it certainly gives you an insight into the time.
That's what makes it so exciting, isn't it? That sense of legend and history and myth kind of melding together, and where's the boundaries, all that kind of stuff. Well, one thing we do know, they were certainly here where we're training in East Anglia. A strong connection with the Vikings here, right?
Very much so, yeah. So the documented landing of the Great Heathen Army, they wintered not very far from here, up in Thetford Forest, and there's a huge amount of historical finds that have been found in this area, but also we've got a wealth of Anglo-Saxon history. So the Kingdom of East Anglia, which then became part of the Danelaw, was a prevalent area for the Vikings. They saw it as rich farmland. They were going to protect it as much much as they possibly could, and as they expanded across the country, some successes, some not so successful, ended up really settling in this area, particularly in East Anglia and where we are here in Suffolk. A lot of the place names are still remnants of the Viking time.
Well, listen, if I make it through this duel that I'm about to fight, maybe I'll take the time to retire and settle here as well, but I'll have to survive it first. So any last tips for me?
No, potentially just prepare for your retirement early.
Great, thanks Phil.
With the talking almost over, my thoughts now turn to my opponent. While there's no direct evidence of women fighting for the Great Army in England, it certainly can't be discounted. It was recently discovered that a high-status warrior grave in Berserkers, Sweden, long assumed to be male, actually contained female remains. And in general, Viking women enjoyed greater legal freedoms than in other early medieval societies. In any case, the appointed time and place for our duel had been set, and I didn't want to be late.
So I'm feeling pretty nervous about my duel now. Mouth's a bit dry. I brought along my Thor's hammer amulet for good luck. These kind of things were found in Viking graves all over Britain from the 9th century. The term Holmgang literally means island going, and there's a sense that in the early days this literally meant rowing out to a small island off the coast of Scandinavia to settle your differences. But going forward, really the Holmgang was a duel that was fought according to a strict set of rules. It was often fought in a square marked by hazel sticks. The key thing really was that right and wrong was decided by violence.
Now, both meet fully armed. If the insulted one falls, the compensation is half a weregild. If he who is offended falls, insults are the worst. The tongue, the head's bane. He shall lie in a field of no compensation.
Try again.
Just as my fellow Vikings were pondering whether to cremate me or leave me for the crows, I managed to regain my faculties, thankful I'd invested in a male shirt. I'd survived the Holmgang, but only just.
In some ways, survival for Vikings who came over to England wasn't really the goal. They were quite happy to go to Valhalla. That was the honourable fate for all warriors. But we know still that they met some really gruesome ends. I mean, if you look at the Repton warrior, spear through the eye socket, possibly had his private parts cleaved off. These were gruesome ways to go. We can't really talk confidently about numbers when it comes to the Great Viking Army. Debate on the actual size of the force itself has ranged from anywhere between 30 men up to 5,000. So when we're talking about how many made it through to the end of those campaigns in the 860s and 70s, it's pretty hard to say. But we do know that enough of them survived to leave traces back in Scandinavia, and plenty of them settled here in England, bringing their families over and ushering in a wave of migration, transforming the landscape and leaving a legacy that's plain for everyone who lives here to see.
The invasion of the Great Viking Army was ended with the Battle of Edington in 878, a victory for King Alfred of Wessex, which would also earn him the moniker of the Great. But far from melting away back to Scandinavia, the defeated Vikings secured legal rights to settle East Anglia on the condition that their leader was baptised. Added to the lands already conquered by the Great Army, the so-called Danelaw held sway over much of northern England, from London in the southeast to the Irish Sea in the northwest. Though it would last less than a century, the story of Britain was now closely bound with that of the Vikings. The last serious invasion launched by a Scandinavian ruler was in 1066, the ill-fated campaign of Harald Hardrada. But integration of previous generations of settlers meant the country was already transformed. In many ways, the Vikings never really left. Thanks again to Bloodhorn Angler and Halder Reenactment for making this episode possible. And don't forget to click on the link below to sign up for your free trial with MyHeritage. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider helping us out with a coffee, liking, commenting, and subscribing to the channel.
Video and leave us a comment.